There's an old wisdom story about a king who announces a wedding feast for his son. And he gathered the village elders and had one simple request. Please bring a jar of fine wine and pour it into a great stone vessel prepared for the feast. And they all agreed. It was a splendid idea. One elder returned home and told his wife, and she paused. She's kind of bothered by the idea. The king is wealthy, she said. Why should we be asked to contribute? There'll be plenty of wine. We can just bring a jar of water. One jar in that big vat won't make a difference. And her husband agreed. That sounded reasonable. On the day of the great celebration, a mood of anticipation filled the air. Each of the elders, they came forward one by one and held their jar high as they ceremoniously poured it into the great vessel. And the people cheered after each elder had finished. Everyone was eager to taste what would certainly be such wonderful wine created from such extravagance. The servants then moved around the tables, filling each cup. The king and the elders held their cups up and drank first. And each elder took a sip and nodded their heads. Oh, such delight. Only pretending that the rich blend of their combined wines was the best thing they'd ever tasted. And the king faked it too, secretly burning with anger. Then the eager guests lifted their cups, but one by one, when they tasted it, they stopped. Their smiles faded and their conversation turned into murmurs. You see, in the privacy of their own homes, each elder had made the same quiet calculation. It won't matter. Someone else will provide what I myself will withhold. Now, if the elders hadn't made such a big deal of grandly pouring their generous jars of wine into the great vessel, everyone would have suspected the king had been cheap. And such a scandal would have been whispered behind the king's back for years. Because when a public celebration fails, the host carries the shame. Well, in today's gospel, those hushed voices would have forever talked of shame behind the back of the groom's family. That is, if Mary had not spoken up. But first, let's place this story in context. Very beginning, chapter 2 of John. And John, doesn't start his gospel about Jesus at his birth in the manger or with shepherds and angels. No, John places Jesus at the birth of the cosmos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John presents Jesus as the very life of God, entering the world as light. He continues, however, the world did not recognize the light. And then that prologue moves from the sweeping cosmic theology to something more concrete and visible. John the Baptist stands as a witness to the light, pointing and saying, pay attention. God's doing something here. And naturally, people begin to ask questions. Who is he? What's happening? And slowly, without fanfare or even explanation, people begin to follow him, one by one. Philip and Nathanael and Andrew and Simon Peter. And they don't fully understand, but they do get a sense that something of God is unfolding in him. But we don't learn about God from abstract doctrine. We learn by watching what Jesus does. And so what is the first revelation of God in the flesh? He fixes a wine shortage and keeps a party going and from collapsing in shame. That's the very first story, which John calls the first sign. Now, what a way to begin. to keep the joy going. Doesn't demand belief. He doesn't organize a new religion. He simply creates more abundance than necessary. And, hear this, just as importantly, he protects a family from humiliation. So again, here's the story. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, as Jesus and his disciples were there, and so was his mother. And his mother is the one who sets everything in motion. Do you notice this? When she says, they've run out of wine. And the funny thing is, Jesus' reaction was like she was bothering him. It's like, Mom, why is this my problem? Or, it's not yet time. But she didn't respond to his hesitation. She just said, do whatever he says. She saw the family's crisis looming, and she took action. Because running out of wine wasn't just socially embarrassing. It could mark your family's reputation for years, maybe even generations. And this is not about looking good or your ego, because honor and shame were matters of survival. In a small village world without banks and contracts and safety nets, your reputation determined everything. Who would lend to you? Who would stand with you in a dispute? Who would welcome your children into their families? A public failure at something as important as a wedding feast could haunt a household for years. And so despite whatever reluctance Jesus had, he acted. And because he acted, the wine did not run out. Only the servants knew what happened. As you heard, the head waiter didn't, and in fact, complimented the groom by saying this wine was better than what had already been served, which is a detail that would be remembered for years. No one pours the best wine last. So you remember that opening story, the old story, the wisdom story of the elders, concluding that someone else would provide what they themselves withheld. A celebration that collapsed into murmurs. But at Cana, the opposite. Abundance overflowed. And so who is Jesus? This is the question at the heart. You begin with the first sign. At a simple wedding in a village where joy is about to run out, God is revealed as dignity protecting, abundance creating, and radically generous. When the wine runs low, God doesn't tighten the flow. God doesn't calculate who deserves help, doesn't lecture the family about better planning. Just multiplies the need more than what's needed joyfully. And once you recognize the difference between a world organized around fear and scarcity and a world shaped by a God who keeps the joy going, creating more, well, how can we not line up to follow Jesus? And what would that mean? Well, we would begin by noticing who is about to run out and share what we have. Not guarding or hoarding, but reversing the logic of scarcity. Instead of the elders' response, we would joyfully proclaim, I will provide what someone else may withhold. And giving up the logic of scarcity is our deeper work in Lent. Giving up the lie that those with more would be harmed if everyone had enough. Or that abundance for all is somehow a threat to those who already have plenty. I mean, we're constantly told the economic reality is that there's not enough for everyone to live with dignity. But that is not an economic reality. It's a moral decision. When those with much more than enough insist on fiscal responsibility, that claiming that caring for the least would cost them too much, well, that is not fiscal responsibility. It is a moral crisis. At a time of staggering inequality, it is America's moral failure to insist that there is not enough for everyone to live with honor rather than shame. And Lent invites us to expose those falsehoods and retrain our instincts so that when the wine begins to run low, our first reflex is not to fear, but to pour some more. But wait, so there's more. I talked about this being in a context. John then immediately does something fascinating. He moves straight from this scene of overflowing wine at the village wedding to standing in the temple in Jerusalem, flipping over tables and driving out the money changers. Do you realize this? Yes, in John, that the cleansing of the temple comes immediately after the wedding at Cana, which is not accidental. That is theological. We're just being introduced, right? This is the beginning of John. We're just being introduced to who this Jesus is. In this first story, Jesus protecting a family from public shame. And in the very next story, he is at the temple confronting an economic system that creates shame in the name of religion. And both stories are about access to joy and dignity, access to God, who has it, who is denied it, who claims the right to control it. In the temple courts, worship required the proper currency and approved sacrifices, which is all fine and good. It serves a purpose. But in practice, it burdened the poor. And it turned prayer into a transaction, and it made worship something to be purchased. And Jesus draws the line when worship becomes another place where people are told they don't have enough. Because no, there is abundance, enough for all. And in a few minutes, we will watch it happen right here. Our annual Super Bowl. A handful of soup pots becoming thousands of meals for neighbors to be fed with honor. The quiet miracle of abundance multiplying in real time. There won't be any stone jars in there. And I don't think there'll be any overturned tables, unless someone's really upset that they did not win the golden spoon. But whenever people refuse the logic of scarcity and refuse to leave anyone behind in quiet shame, whenever people do this, they are a living sign of God's first act in Jesus. Pouring out joy, protecting honor with generous hospitality, extravagant generosity. And this Lent, let that be our story too.